So, sustainable food. Next slide, please. I will also point out slides that you should never show. So sometimes you show things that you should never do as an example. This is one of those slides. Never show a PowerPoint with this many words. So I highlighted in red the message. And it says, for those in the back who can't read it, this is a publication from the well-known journal Nature, and it talks about the growth in demand for food in the coming years. Many people who look to the future will point out 2050 as a point. So that's a reference point. It's arbitrary, but it certainly will be in your lifetime. So the kinds of things we're talking about. Next slide, please. This also is a very bad slide that you cannot see, but let me just tell you, the middle column points out the population, the 2014 numbers. The right-hand slide is the 2050 numbers. It talks about population being in the order of 7 billion, going up to 9 billion or so by 2050. The kind of topics I want to cover are pointed out here. The people living in cities. By 2050, it's estimated that 70% of all humans on Earth will either be living near or in city. Next slide, please. These are the kinds of graphs we have all seen. You can see that we are at 2023 now, well on our way to 7, 8, 9 billion people. Next slide, please. Most of that growth is occurring, as you can see. Some people who make projections will try and model fast growth, medium growth, low growth. Nonetheless, the shape of the curve is like that. And on my left side, the colored lines, and again, print too small, so I'll explain. Most of the growth is occurring in Asia, South Asia. The lowest lines on that graph is in North America. I was reading an article in the New York Times titled, "Italy is Disappearing." And in countries like Italy and Japan, where the aging population is exploding and no one's having babies, that formula equals disappearance. And that kind of trend is happening, but in a lot of developing countries around the world, populations are increasing. Next slide, please. This, again, points to the trend about many of us moving to cities. And I'm going to come back to this theme over and over again. The number of people growing, the move to cities, and what that means for our planet. Next slide, please. This used to be the largest migration of animals on Earth. The wildebeest and zebras migrating and running across the Masai Mara and the Serengeti plains in Africa. And I've seen this, it's very impressive. Next slide, please. But it's no longer, by any stretch, the largest migration of animals on Earth. This is, next slide. Next slide, please. And in China, yes, many people have moved to cities, but at Lunar New Year's, they buy gifts and go home to their communities. And hundreds of millions of people, 300, 400, 500 million people will get on airplanes and trains and buses and automobiles to go home. And that is by far the largest migration of animals on our planet now. And next slide, these pictures just point out the kind of crowds one can see. I went to Lulu Mall on Saturday night, and it was along with the rest of Cochin. Next slide, please. And so what does this mean? That we will have to feed all these people. The estimated amount of food that we will have to produce more of in the coming years is astounding. Next slide, please. Another slide, never make one like this. I highlight in boxes, the top red box is about 70%. About 70% of all the drinkable water is going to agriculture now. And the countries that are doing that the most, on the bottom red slide, is North America. They irrigate patches of vegetables in the desert for the market, when it should never happen like that. Next slide, please. We'll just go on. Next slide, please. That green slide was to make this point, that the yellow circles expanding is, along with the number growth, the number of people moving to cities is exploding. Why do they do that? They're out to improve their quality of life. They're coming for jobs and for the comforts. And we know that, we experience that. But the problem is, next slide please, is that this class, more than any other, consumes more stuff. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. And they also dispose of all these things. So along with that growth and the move to cities is an unprecedented amount of things going into our environment that contribute to climate change. This slide shows the top of the world. And in early days, when people tried to go across the top of the earth, they often died. And these kind of shipwrecks were found. Go ahead again. And now, due to the shrinking and melting of snow and ice, you can take a pleasure cruise in a fancy boat across the top of the world. That's how it's changing. But it's so far away, and that's another issue about living in comfortable places in the city. Those things about climate change and things are just happening too far away. But even home, you must be noticing changes in climate patterns. Certainly in my home, the seasons are changing, the temperature rise and highs and lows are finding new records. You might have read in British Columbia last year, it got so hot that an entire town burned up. It was so hot, 49 degrees, which is never heard of in that part of the world. A train came, and the train, as it was turning the corner, sparks flew from the wheels, ignited a fire, and the entire town, 100% burned to the ground. That kind of thing is happening. You hear about wildfires, you hear about floods and landslides. These are the kinds of things you see in news and perhaps are close to sometimes that are indications of the larger changes. Next slide, please. Again, we can move on, but I want to make the point that food production systems are getting maxed out, whether in vegetables, animal proteins, or otherwise. Next slide, please. In terms of agriculture, one can grow crops in one layer across a field, but things are going vertical. You can even buy containers, entirely self-contained units that will continuously produce food for you in a box. This, of course, in America, but those kinds of things are available. Next slide, please. And food factories are a reality. These are some pictures from Japan, where through hydroponics, they're growing things vertically. So for the same square area, you can increase production, as these pictures show. But even that is struggling to keep up. Next slide. In a lot of cities, people are putting greenhouses on buildings, mostly to capture all the free heat that's escaping to the air. But frankly, it's not volume-wise, nothing too significant. So when I got back from Japan in 2016, I then retired first. And together with a past student, we formed a company. And we thought, what can we do for the planet? And we thought, you know, in North America, and perhaps in neighborhoods here, you will have an area in front of your house, and you plant grass and some flowers and a tree that looks very nice, but it's useless for food production. So we thought we would go to your house and say to you, how about if we take over half of your yard and produce vegetables? And they say, I don't know how to grow vegetables. I don't want And we said, that's what we do. We will come by once a week, tend to your garden, check in on security if you like, and then you will get fresh vegetables and we take the rest. Now, if that got implemented in cities in North America or all over the world, the volume is there for fresh food close to consumers. So we thought that was fantastic. But I'll tell you more about that story in a few moments. Next slide, please. These are just a couple of pictures of the intense kind of food production systems that are existing today. The density of food production is going up, like that green picture there. Next slide, please. And in certain places, perhaps you know, like in Almeria, Spain, these are not plots, these are greenhouses. And this one area supplies more than 50% of the vegetables for Europe. Now, producing, next slide please, food by greenhouses has many advantages. It's controllable, it's traceable, you can collect data and control all the seasons and parameters like that. But it also has dangers. Can you imagine that one area where all that food production takes place? If something were to happen to that one area, what it would do? So we have to think. I think there's great hope in community-based food production systems. Next slide, please. So it's been mentioned that I work with fish. And I know about fish. There's a lot I don't know. So later on in questions, you might hear me say, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about that. But here we go about aquaculture and fish farming. Next slide, please. This graph shows the consumption of seafood or foods from the ocean and waters over time. That's the dark green pattern. It's been increasing for some time, and it continues to increase. It's a good source of protein. It's an affordable, sometimes, source of protein, but it is increasing. We're eating more of it. The orange line, however, is the pattern of how much we can capture from the sea. And since the 1970s, it's plateaued off in spite of the increase in consumption. No matter how we improve our technology and know where the fish are, when to get them, we're not getting any more. So what's making up the difference? Aquaculture. Next slide. Or the farming of these things. This complicated slide just makes the point that more than an increasing amount of farmed products are being consumed to make up the shortage in wild capture. Fish farming, plant farming from the oceans is like agriculture was 100 years ago. We are learning to farm something we have hunted and gathered for all of time. But that is the reality. Let's do it sustainably in a responsible way. This is how a salmon farm looks like near where I live. They make some floats, sink a net, tether it, and the ocean currents naturally flush it. So you don't have to pump water. This is how it's done. But they also transmit pathogens, parasites to wild fish swimming by on the outside. They take up valuable land. And so there are some groups trying to get them out of the water. Next slide, please. Again, the same graph as you saw before in orange and green, but the graph on your right shows that this consumption in seafood is made up of fish, crustacea, mollusks, and plants. All of them are increasing. Next slide, please. So what to do? Let's put them on land. Remember the slide about water consumption? We can't keep using more potable water for this kind of thing. So recirculate the water. Recirculating aquaculture on land is gaining momentum. And I think that's the future where how things are going to go. These are intensive systems that take a lot of money to set up. And they're mostly set up in countries that sell expensive fish, like salmon. I tell people, if you want to feed the hungry, don't grow salmon. Salmon eat other fish protein. You catch the fish, extract the protein, make salmon feed it to the salmon. Just eat the original fish. If you want to feed the masses, then you must at least think of vegetarian fish. Give it vegetables, make protein, simple. And carp, tilapia. There are many examples of that. Next slide, please. So aquaculture has many advantages that are shown for greenhouses. It is controllable, it's traceable, there's food safety issues that you can cover, many, many advantages. But let's do it responsibly. Next slide, please. So aquaponics is an idea I had also while we were thinking about growing vegetables in people's yards. And we thought, the lofty goal was let's put aquaponics on Mars. I'll come back to that. But aquaponics, as I will define, is this. Next slide. It is the culturing together of vegetables and fish. Fish can enrich the water by their ammonia production and feces and uneaten food, and that grows vegetables much more than not having the fish there. And then the plants can filter and improve water quality. It can bring it back to the fish. Next slide. This is a crowded slide just to make the point. Next slide. Is that there are companies that are being made now to grow fish and plants by aquaponics in a commercial scale. No longer the family-oriented small scale, but commercial. In Norway today, they are producing massive aquaponic systems on labs. So you will hear more and more about this. This is the kind of cartoon that just explains the principles. Plants, fish grown together for mutual benefit. Next slide. And modern, they're called RAS systems, R-A-S, recirculating aquaponics, aquaculture systems. And they have these certain components, and they look like variations of this. Next slide. Where you have the fish, you have to filter the solid waste, and then you have to take, by any chance, do you know what the nitrogenous end product of fish is, what they excrete into the water? Ammonia, yes, it is. And so ammonia nitrite has to be converted to less toxic nitrate using bacteria, and then the water has to be filtrated, aerated, and back to the fish. Next slide, please. So and aquaponics in the future, I think, has the potential. I talked about, next slide, please. Energy is a very important component of this. If you came to me and said, you know, I'm from a community of 1,000 people in a certain place, and the next community is hundreds of kilometers away. We have this situation in northern Canada a lot. And those communities are just like island communities. They're isolated. And next to healthcare, the provision and access to affordable and high quality food is a big priority. So while we dreamed about people colonizing Mars and sending food systems to them, the business plan on Earth was to try and address this global need. And that global need will increase because of the pressures we've talked about, the demand for increased food to feed more mouths. So can you go back one? And so energy is very, very important. If you fuel the whole thing with fossil fuels, then it doesn't help climate change. So next slide, energy has to be addressed. So this is a funny little slide. There's this man in the orange vest is an absolute genius. He invented this machine that can take anything made of carbon and make a liquid fuel from it. And what he does is he heats it up with to combustible temperatures with no oxygen. So it doesn't combust, no flame. Under those conditions, all sorts of chemicals leach out. One of them is a combustible fuel he called syngas. And if you look at the black things on the table on the lower, you might detect one that looks like a bird. And it was a bird. Just to make, and he didn't kill it for this, but anyway, he makes the point that anything made of carbon can be used for this. So exciting technologies like this are emerging that can be done inexpensively in small communities. The tall man that went with me on this visit is shown here. His name was John McDonald. He created a company called McDonald Detweiler. And they're known to put Canada in space. If you've seen the International Space Station, you know the white big robotic arm that's there, and astronauts hang on to them and fix various things on the space station in space. That was his company, and they invented that and developed that. And after he retired, he created a solar panel company because he's very burdened with this reality of our energy needs in the future, having to move away from fossil fuels for climate change. Next slide, please. This is just a picture of the Mars thing. But we really believe that a scalable, modular system could serve many people very well, kind of like the children's toy Lego. Similar components, so if you came to me with your community needs, I could open a book and prescribe exactly what you needed to continuously produce animal and protein and vegetables on an ongoing basis, to provide employment, new kinds of work for the young people in the community as well. Next slide, please. So, as I said, these three components are all necessary, including energy, and the two boxes on the right point to the small communities that they can serve. Next. And finally, if you can influence young people to think this way, these are two young girls at a school exhibit showing their aquaponics demonstration with all the benefits that I've spent time talking about. And it is my last slide. So thank you very much.
Say something about that other PowerPoint too. So there are some scholars in ecology.
Oh, the stress one?
Yeah.
Okay, you can put them on. So apparently there are scholars here interested in stress. As students, you know all about stress, right? Examinations, entrance requirements, professors are worried about their grants, you know, there are all kinds of things. So while they're preparing the next PowerPoint presentation, I can give you a little prelude. So we spent a lot of time in my laboratory studying stress. But are there any points of clarification of the first PowerPoint presentation I made? Any questions or comments? Yeah. No? Okay. So it is, I think, a very important point. Many of you might have taken microbiology courses where you've grown fruit flies in a test tube with some mashed bananas on the bottom, and the population doubles and doubles and doubles until it runs out of food and it dies. The fruit flies in that flask, in the last doubling, or just before the last doubling, the doubling before the last one, don't know that the next doubling will kill them. And my friend likes to use that example to press the point of urgency. We might be sitting here comfortable, well-fed, and learned in a city, but we don't know. We live as if tomorrows will always come. But take it. Think about how synergistic all the pressures and stresses in our world place on our plants and animals that are feeding us. Domestic things are one thing, but if we're talking about fish and wild animals and plants, the stresses on them are acting synergistically. So, I also point to people when a fish population crashes, it doesn't just peter out, they crash. And people wonder what happened. And so the kinds of things can happen that way. So the urgency is something that I very much feel. Next slide, please. So this is about a little story of stress. Okay, thank you. Great. Maybe I'll...
You can point the...
Yeah, but there's an echo developing. So stress in fish is something that is something that we have studied for a long time. Fish are just like us. You might know that if you took a blood sample from your arm and you did the same for a fish, the blood chemistry looks very similar. Sodium 145 millimolars, chloride, bicarbonate, potassium are the same concentrations in a fish. I can talk about brackish and salt water, but we'll do that a little later. But the point is, when they get stressed, they exhibit 3 levels of stress response. One is an acute one that can cause the release of stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline. When your teachers tell you there's a surprise test tomorrow, adrenaline will increase. If you're in a difficult relationship, cortisol will increase, chronic stress over time. And make no mistake, the stress response is advantageous. Those hormones increase blood sugar levels to help you fight or flight from the stress. If you didn't have the stress response, you'd be dead. So this helps maintain us. But then prolonged stress can have negative effects on growth, fecundity, reproductive ability, etc., and our immune function. So it's no secret that when you're stressed, you might get sick more easily, those kinds of things. So that happens, and this is just a cartoon to show an increased spike in adrenaline that happens right away, and then a more prolonged increase in cortisol, and blood sugars increase for the reasons I've mentioned. So all kinds of things cause stress in fish, physical ones, chemical ones, behavioral ones. When we stress fish, sometimes we can just quietly pour the water that contains the predator of this fish into this tank, and they just go nuts because they can smell the predators in the tank. All kinds of things, behavioral as well. So, you know, this is happening on fish farms. When you fish for sport, the fish at the end of your line certainly is being stressed. And, you know, this is an example, again, of that, a cartoon of that salmon farm-like aquaculture near my waters. The interaction between the farmed animals and the wild environment is there, not only in the things that fall out, but also in the health implications on wild fish. This is the kind of experiments we do, and when you study stress in fish, you can't open the tank, grab a fish, cut the tail off, and get the blood, because that's very stressful. So what we do is we have a surgical table, we put them to sleep, we put catheters in their blood vessels, and let them recover for a few days in a tank, and when we need blood, we quietly take it from the catheter. So, and then we add various stressors in a controlled way and better understand the stress response. So this is, we also have studied it at the cellular level. Many of you might be in molecular and cell biology, and there's something called heat shock proteins or stress proteins that are highly conserved across animal kingdom, animal species and plants that respond and are vital to the proper functioning of cells. They primarily help proper folding, the three-dimensional structure of proteins, which defines their activity, and they help transport, unfolding and refolding across compartments in the cell. And when the cell is stressed by lack of oxygen, acidity changes, toxins, heat shock proteins increase as a mechanism. And there are some constitutively produced, they're always there, but they ramp up in the face of stress. So we are guilty of stressing fish all over the world in all kinds of ways, from Antarctica to the Amazon to Southeast Asian coral fishes to sharks in Italy. We are guilty of that. We have looked at physical stress, biological stress, psychological stress, and we have studied them in whole animals and in immortalized cell lines in all levels of biological organization. And we can say that the increase in heat shock protein 70 is like cortisol, a general response to all kinds of stressors. So I'm going to move through the next few slides somewhat quickly because they're rather detailed. It's an experiment we did where we infected the fish with, I think it was a Vibrio angularum in this case, and we followed the progression of the disease. So in these slides, X is the time axis. On the right side, you will see Vibrio angularum viable counts, or the pathogen is increasing, the red squares you see there. And then on the right side is plasma cortisol, which is in the green. So you'll see that the experimental animals are the blue line, and the control fish injected with a sham injection, not the pathogen, is on the bottom. You see that first bump? That's the injection stress. And then the progression of the disease happens, and cortisol and stress levels increase as the disease increases, ending in death in many cases. So this is liver heat shock protein 70, same kind of pattern. Progression increases with the disease. And this is also head kidney tissue. And when we do a smear like this is a tissue smear of head kidney. You'll see the bright green dots. Those are where the pathogen, that's the Vibrio angularum. And then you see the red glow around them. Those are the tissues showing heat shock protein 70 increasing in the foci or area of infection. A lot of times anoxic conditions happen and other stressful things surround the cells, and heat shock protein increases. So that happens, and I will not, this is another story that I won't go into because it's a bit detailed, but there are these really cute little fish called sculpins that live in the tide pool. If you've been to near the ocean where there are rocks and there are isolated tide pools, you know, at low tide, have you seen those? Well, imagine this. There are fish that live in them, and these little guys home to them. When we put a little green dot, a dye on their fin, and we can end up sounding very nasty, but take them up to 100 yards away from their home tide pool. In 2 tidal cycles, they're back home. So they come back to their home tide pools. But imagine this, from day to day, from tide to tide, they don't know what that tide pool is going to be like, especially if it's a small tide pool. If it rains heavily, the salinity can go to fresh water. And when it gets really hot on a sunny day, temperatures increase. But they don't know that. But they have to be ready for all kinds of stresses. And we found a situation where there are these, those are my sons giving free labor, collecting tide pools, sculpins. There are certain tide pool sculpins that live in all the tide pools, and one that lives only in the higher tide pools, and one that lives only in the lower tide pools. So we discovered 3 tide pool sculpins in this environment, and we studied through experimentation how they ready themselves. Then at the end of the story is that they're very well adapted, and temperature differences or 2 or 3 degrees make a difference in how they distribute themselves. Not just in the tide pool, but in a larger mapping of the area. So these are, as I say, I'm not going to go in detail because it's a lot. But this is an aerial view of Vancouver, where I live, and it shows in orange or red and yellow the temperature profile. You see where it's red? It's about 2 degrees warmer than the yellow areas. And like the tide pool, that small difference in temperature determines the distribution of these animals. So let's, I'll just carry on. The point is, and at the end of these experiments, we discovered that there's something called hormesis that happens, that if you stress fish mildly, they become more resistant to stronger stresses. Somehow there's a tempering effect that happens that could ready them for future stresses, and we think this might be happening in the tide pools and how they protect themselves from unpredictable stressors. So this is some of the data. Let me just quickly. So we tied the heat shock response and the stress response at the cellular level to a larger distribution and where they're found. So I'm sorry that was a little rapid, but I didn't want to get too much into the details, but those are some of the take-home messages. Thank you. So are there any questions? Yes. Yeah, in polluted waters. So I understand some of you are doing toxicity studies. You may be exposing fish or plants or some organism to toxins. And I would guess that heat shock protein 70 will increase in animals that are receiving the toxin compared to your control groups. So in such cases, I don't, what we haven't done is try and bolster artificially the heat shock protein levels in certain animals or tissues and exposing them to stressors and seeing with the hypothesis that they would be more resistant, I think that you're suggesting. But these are just observations that we make through experimentation. We haven't done more invasive experiments, but you know, you might imagine a rat or cell line that has higher constitutive levels of heat shock protein 70 there, and they might be more resistant to stress than your control groups. And the question is, why did we choose HSP 70? We didn't from the beginning choose 70. We've looked at 10, 12, 70, 90, 120, a whole host. You know, we looked at the protein profile of the exposed animals and observed that there are, you know, a range of things, but 70 is the one that changed every time, no matter what the stressor was, across so many animal groups and so many levels of organization, whether it was a cell line or a whole animal or perfused tissue, it increased. The thing it doesn't increase to is handling stress. So you remember the infection experiment, the first bump of cortisol? Heat shock protein, if you saw there, doesn't increase because of handling. But it just came out that 70 was a general response, where others didn't respond, or some here, some there, but 70 across the board. And there was a question. The question is, how do I think climate change will affect aquaculture? Well, I think that climate change can affect aquaculture in different ways. My latest publication is a book called Fish Disorders and Non-Infectious Fish Disorders and Climate Change. There are certain disorders associated with temperature, prolonged temperature change, small temperature change over long times, and the book documents that. So climate change can affect something like that. It can, of course, affect temperature. If you look at the distribution of fish populations in the world, all of them are moving north. The southernmost distribution of many species are moving north. But this is not aquaculture. This is fish population dynamics. But aquaculture, I suppose, it's such a controlled environment, you could land it on Mars. You could land it in different places and still control the environment. But so yeah, that's a very good question. I think in many different ways it can affect it. But it, again, like a greenhouse is a controlled environment, trying to isolate what's outside from what's happening inside. So you can, except if you are growing shrimp in ponds and you're growing things extensively where you're subject to the natural environment, you're going to find warmer waters, tidal fluctuation changes, rising sea levels, and all those things that are associated with climate change. So yes, depending on what farming you're doing in aquaculture, it could have an effect. But these kind of intensive systems, not so much. Thank you.
So mine is a general question. Whether the stress factor affects the migration of fishes, that we have catadromous and anadromous migration. So whether the stress factor is a hindrance to the migration of the fishes.
Migration. Thank you for an excellent question. There are many things I don't know, but the things we have observed are the following. Salmon, and I was enjoying very much eating the sardine, matti. Really delicious. But I looked into the biology. I guess they move from Kerala to Goa and back, and the reproduction occurs like this. And I guess animals like this will move. If there's some kind of new stress in the waters of Cochin, they'll move. But other fish don't move. In my area of the world, there's a Pacific cod, and the female legs the egg mass there, and the male incubates it until hatch. Rather equitable situation. But anyway, they will not move until the eggs hatch. If you go to coral reefs, those are territorial animals that will stay there. So no matter what stresses come to them, and I've seen it many, many times, erosion, oil spills, they will just stay there and exposing themselves, tied behaviorally to that place and subject themselves. So migration questions are critically important to us who study salmon, because as a baby, as you know, as alevins, they hatch in a freshwater creek. After a year, when they're this big, they migrate to the ocean, changing completely their salinity environment, go up and grow up in Alaska, and 4 years later, migrate back down, stop eating, and swim upstream to the very creek they were born to hatch. So all of that involves migration. They have to pass through city waters, hundreds of kilometers, and thus exposing themselves cumulatively to all the climate change effects of all of that route. And so I think it's a critically important question for which I have very little knowledge.
So my question is,
Yes.
of all the biomarkers, your study was on HSP70. Why did you choose HSP70?
We chose HSP70 because we observed this heat shock protein, like cortisol, to increase when fish were treated with a very wide range of stressors. So I'm also a little bit skeptical about how much of a good biomarker it is, because the assay techniques are expensive and tedious, not easily carried out by practitioners to whom this is important. Whether you're a fish farmer or an environmental scientist, they don't have access to, this kind of equipment. So it might be academically interesting to pursue basic questions, but I'm still personally a little skeptical about how good a biomarker it is. But the reason we chose it was that it kept increasing no matter what we did to the fish, across many tissues.
So which is the most affordable biomarker that can be used in case of stress?
Well, if you ask the fish farmer, they might talk about growth or disease resistance. You tend to know, without measuring anything, when you're stressed. Or maybe not. Maybe you're not so conscious of it. But in terms of affordable, cortisol measurements are a direct stress hormone that you can measure with ELISA techniques. And in humans, at least, without taking a blood sample, as you probably know, your saliva levels of cortisol fairly well mimic what happens in your blood. So you thought I was a mean scientist. I know these psychologists that do incredible things to humans like yourselves. So they would take subjects in and do stress experiments. I was talking to Dr. Chakrapani about this because some people in the AI world feel that they can monitor facial characteristics as a biomarker of stress. But this laboratory in psychology, for example, will take bright students like you, and they say, we're going to ask you some questions, and when the buzzer goes off, please spit into this cup. And they have many of them lined up. So they begin. Starting from 100, count down in increments of 7. 193, and you go. And then they interrupt you saying, can you go a little faster? Most people go a little faster. And so you think, okay. And so you speed it up. And then they come in and say, oh, stop, forget it. Let's move on to another test. Which makes you kind of feel like, I'm not performing. And then they do this multiple times. And then you keep spitting. And they're measuring the cortisol levels. And then they go, could you wait in the restroom afterwards and have water, cookie, and just stay there for 30 minutes to recover? And the people who have a type A personality will reflect on what seemed like a failed test and get stressed and stressed and stressed. And others of us think, that was kind of useless, and just cortisol levels go down. They do that kind of thing where you can impose stressors and look at perhaps new things. But this is a fairly non-invasive way, in humans anyway. And some people have tried to measure these hormones in the water so that you're not having to catch the fish and get the blood and that kind of thing. But it's rather difficult once it gets diluted in the water. So I don't, again, have a great answer for that. Yes, I think it is. I think it is. Making posters and having awareness classes is very important for people who haven't thought about those things before. And often when you have an awareness class, people who come to those classes are already aware. Many of them are aware. But you want to raise awareness in people like my mother used to be, and say, the environment's changing, and she says, oh, well, that's nice, let's have a cup of tea. And so it is, all of that, I think, is very important to do, all of it. But that's why I think it's rather captivating to have children do it. When my grandchildren do it, I pay attention. And if you can convince them that something serious is happening in the environment and have them do posters like that and talk to the public, it's very, very engaging, I find. When you get a professor or a smart student in front of a group, they will say certain things, but you need to, I think, connect to society. That's why I think transmitting your message in science in an understandable language to society is very important. So I'll tell you one story. Wherever I worked, I would always open a science cafe. It started in France, a movement called Café Scientifique, and I would go to a coffee shop and say, do you have a slow night in your week? And they would say, yeah, Tuesday is kind of slow, every week. So I would say, do you mind if I brought some professors from the university just for 20 minutes, and they will talk on subjects based in science that I think society should hear. Can you drink the tap water? Can you eat farm salmon? Are ATMs safe for your finances? The kinds of things so I would bring in a professor, and then I would buy some gift vouchers from the cafe and give it to the professor for talking. Then before the talk starts, I would circulate saying, a scientific talk is about to start, but it's going to be in understandable language. Please don't leave, or can I buy your coffee for you? And that night always became the most popular of the week, and with humorous things. Have you ever seen the Muppets, the children's show with the puppets? So in the Muppets, there are these two crotchety guys in the audience, and they're always interrupting. And we had such a person in one place, and every problem you could mention was due to the population increase in the world. It didn't matter if it was ATMs or disease, everything was due to population. So those kinds of unexpected things happen, but connecting with the public who aren't aware is, I think, critically important in their language, in understandable language. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
So this is an outsider's question because I am a teacher of the humanities here. I teach literature. I'm from the humanities department. Yeah, so this is going to be an outsider's question. So the way I understand it, you're studying stress in fishes, right? But this is done under two broadly and vastly different circumstances. Because on the one hand, you mentioned about how it can be done in a very controlled manner, even on Mars, if you chose to. And then you had this slide where you were doing experiments off the coast of Vancouver, outside, right? And these are extremely different things. One is a very controlled environment, and the other one might perhaps be more concerned about things like climate change and the migration pattern, how fishes survive out in the wild, and all those things. So when you study stress response in fishes, what motivates you? Because on the one hand, if you're talking about studying how fish thrive under controlled environments, I could see how that could have implications for harvesting fish, for food safety and sustainability and other things. Whereas the other aspect of it seems to me like is concerned more with projects of conservation. It's about conserving wildlife and other things. So I'm concerned about what motivates you. Is there an ethical dimension to your study? That's what I would like to know.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I hope you heard it. The question was, it looks like we've studied many different things, from controlled environments and aquaculture that benefits farmers to other things that seem to be related to conservation in the natural environment. It's true. I'll answer the question in two ways. One is that we've always been motivated by basic science questions of how things work. So when I talked about hormesis and that kind of, not discovery, but observation that maybe we are dealing with systems where animals can pre-stress themselves mildly to temper themselves for an unknown future. When we did experiments like put a fish over here and with warming waters until hot water over there, but put food in the hot water, you see it tempering, you see it going back and forth, and then darting for the food. When salmon come from salt water to fresh water, you see them going back and forth, tempering themselves and going. So it excites us to try and advance knowledge to areas, things that we did not know before through basic science questions. But also, it is very gratifying and I think satisfying for us to do research that helps the practical production of food, for example. And we get pulled into all kinds of arguments, but I think as a university, one reason there are many different topics in my lab is I've always asked my graduate students, what would you like to study? Or when they write to me, they say, I would like to study this. I had one student come from Japan, and a very gifted student, and her professor said to me, tapped me on the shoulder, they're very reserved, and said, taking this person as a graduate student would not be the worst thing you could do in life. That was his highest recommendation. Anyway, so she came to my lab, and after a year, she looked a little sad, and I said, what's wrong? What's the matter? She said, well, this isn't really what I want to study. And I said, what do you want to really study? She said, I would like to study polar bears. I said, polar bears? We're in a fish lab. And so she said, I've always liked the Arctic. I know my professor just told me to come to your lab and do what you said and everything will work out. But if you ask me today, that's what I want to do. I said, well, I'm sorry, we're not going to work on polar bears, but maybe you can work in polar environments. So she worked in Antarctica and asked the basic question, when Antarctic fish have never experienced temperature change and sit at minus 1.5 degrees, do they have the genetic predisposition to be able to face climate change in the future? So that we did some cellular and molecular studies to find out, yes, the message is there, mRNA is there, and we probably had the wrong sampling time for that regime. We didn't see the protein, the heat shock proteins emerge. But that's why the subjects tend to be varied in my laboratory, because I want you to study what you want to do. And if you don't know what you want to do, well then read the literature. And let's come up with something that you can be passionate about. So that's why there's always been a bit of range in the kinds of things we study. And of course, practically, there's funding. They're funding programs that fund certain things, and we've always collected research funds. And when you pull them together, there's always a little bit enough to do the kinds of things that are not related to the projects we applied for. So there's all in a large going concern. And thanks, by the way, to Keralites. My postdocs have all been from Kerala, so it's been wonderful. But we've always respected, I think, the motivation of the students. And what I observe here, I've always said, it's a bit of a phrase, that universities should have 3 R's for values. That they should be respected, that they should be responsive to the needs of society, and relevant to the important things in the world. And I observe that in universities here, including yours. And so I'm, again, for those reasons and others, delighted to be here with you. Any other questions?
Sir, here. Sir, you have discussed about scaling up of production of vegetables and fishes. What measures have been taken for the scale up of grains and fruits which grow on trees?
On aquaponics is the question?
In general, how do we scale up the production of grains and trees which grow on land?
Yes, which grow on land. And you know, the amount of land available is that you can farm is being maxed out, as I said. I know in Canada we send the large amount of pulse consumed in India comes from Canada, and I've seen the pulse fields. Imagining some system that could replace that is very difficult. But no doubt, more will have to be produced to feed those numbers. So again, I don't have the answers because my background is not in agriculture. Perhaps some in this room would have an idea of how you can scale up production given limited resources. Because it's grown in soil on land now, might not mean that's the only way you can grow them. Perhaps you have colleagues that are doing experiments like this who are exploring different ways that you could grow those nutritionally and culturally important food items for the future. So I'm sorry, I don't know.
I am asking about the opportunities at North America. Few of the students and scholars from here they may be interested in developing a career there. So what is your advice those who are coming there, how to approach the universities, how to approach the professors? What is your suggestion?
Okay. So we'll switch gears to post-secondary education, and I will guarantee you the food's not going to be better. But perhaps you have questions about studying abroad. And let me stimulate your mind by talking to you about the university that I just worked at. It's called Quest University. Quest University is a small private university near Vancouver that is unique in several ways. It's only a few hundred students. They all live in residence. This university has no departments and no majors. Every student has a question, and in second year, you develop the question, and that question is the focus of your entire curriculum. Every student has a mentor. Each professor has a few mentors, and we ask you, what are you passionate about? What are you passionate about? Some people say, I want to study medicine. Okay, let's make sure you have all the prerequisites to go on to medical school. And you know, let me think of one. Ali Just is a graduate, and I saw her and I said, what was your question? So she told me about her question. She graduated from Quest, went to Oxford to do a medical, she was the Bill Gates Cambridge Scholar in medicine and studied medical genetics there, and then came back to become a doctor at UBC's medical school. Alice Naje from Africa came to Quest. She graduated and actually she went for graduate studies to Oxford too, and now is the Facebook representative in Ghana for social justice. I can't remember, but students are quite varied in what they can study. But it's an unusual school, and they study one subject at a time. You and I have studied 4, 5, 6 subjects at a time. They do 3.5 weeks of one course, and then they study the next one, and then the next one. In 1 year, they cover the same number of courses, but in a different way. So we can have an Antarctica class. We can have biodiversity in Peru, and art history in Paris, and that kind of thing. Olympians come that can train and continue their education. The face of Giorgio Armani, the fashion thing, is a graduate of ours who can go to New York City for photo shoots and continue their education. But faculty members, when they are not teaching, can go away for 3.5 weeks and do research uninterrupted. So there are innovative models of education, but by and large, in Canada, the universities are public. They're run by the government and funded. So tuition is not so expensive compared to the US. It's maybe between $3,000 and $6,000 Canadian, not US, Canadian dollars, which is much cheaper. And you have to pay room and board on top of that. But then there's also always international student aid, financial aid of all kinds, from the government, from private sources. There are books. You can sit in an office and go through fellowship after fellowship. Which one do you apply? And they're all online too, so you can investigate that for the practical part of how will I fund it. And this way, Canada is different from the United States, where United States, there's the dominance of many famous private universities. Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, they're all private. And the state-funded universities kind of behave like private-funded universities too. And they can be very expensive. We call our Quest University system the block system. And Colorado College in the US also gives the block system, but they have traditional departments. But their tuition is $70,000 US, just the tuition. And so when our students are going into doctoral programs at Harvard, Yale, and Oxford, American students come to Quest to get that quality of education at a much reduced place. And Quest University is one of the top 10 most beautiful campuses in Canada. It's in a stunning mountain environment on the ocean. So for all those reasons, we get that. But to tell you, generally in Canada, that is the profile. We have many private colleges, but they tend to be faith-based. They tend to be smaller, faith-based liberal arts schools, right? And so rather than go on, perhaps you have questions about studying abroad that I might help you. And they might be for graduate school. I imagine a lot will be for graduate school, or if you're a PhD student, maybe you're looking for postdoctoral opportunities. Or if you're a postdoctoral person, maybe you're looking for faculty positions. And gosh, India and especially Kerala have a great reputation. I should mention that the past Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, wanted to create the best institute of science and technology in the world. So he gathered a board of directors with Nobel laureates on it. He gave it all the money it needed, and it's only PhD school, only PhD graduate studies, no undergraduate. But everyone accepted is fully funded, not just for tuition, travel money, pocket money, book money, it's very generous. And so when I came to CUSAT in the early part of this month, I put on my LinkedIn page that this is what I'm doing. So a professor from OIST, Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, messaged me She said, oh, congratulations. By the way, we get many students from KUSAT to OIST. So this part of the world in India is well known for your educational training, the quality. Thank you to the professors who are giving you mentorship and the opportunities. But you know that. Some of the highest regarded institutions of higher learning are in India, right?